year is 1964. Ford would build an all-new engine family called the Ford FE engine family, which stood for Ford Edsel, which we've already done an episode on. Ford made an engine series inside the FE engine family called the FT, or Ford Truck Engines, and they were only available in F-Series trucks and buses, as well as industrial use. In this engine episode, we will cover the 330, 332, 359, 361, 389, and 391. We are also going to go from base horsepower to max horsepower. It's also worth pointing out that some of these numbers are gross horsepower figures and some of them are net horsepower figures. Gross horsepower figures are best case scenario, whereas net horsepower figures are horsepower figures with all of the accessories attached. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk engine architecture. Bore spacing 4.630 inches and a deck height of 10.170 inches. Combustion chamber is the usual wedge shape in the cylinder head. The block is deep skirted. Cylinder block casting extends below the crankshaft center line, providing great rigidity and support to the crankshaft bearings. The cylinder heads are very narrow, requiring manifold to be part of the valley cover. The major difference between the FE and the FT is the head design, which has exhaust crossover setup. The FT heads have 10 exhaust manifold bolts per head versus 8 on the FE. The FT has larger chambers and smaller ports and valves. Really important side note, in reference to the block, which are virtually identical to the FE design, with a key difference being the distributor pilot hole is 5/16 of an inch instead of 1/4 of an inch. Introduced in 1965, 330 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8, 5.4 liters. It's good for 150 net horsepower, 3,600 RPM, 286 pound-feet, or 387 newton meters at 2,000 RPM, with a bore of 3.875 inches and a stroke of 3.5 inches. Compression is 7.4 to 1. The years this engine was used was between 1965 through 1978. Some sources say 1979. It was used in trucks and used as an industrial engine. It could be found in the F600 or larger trucks. It's important to note that they made two versions of this engine. They made the 330 MD and they made a 330 HD. The HD was only used for U-Haul trucks. The HD also used a forged crankshaft, larger counterweights, thicker crank snout, thicker flywheel flange. Up next, 332 cubic inch displacement overhead valve, V8, 5.4 liters. It's important to note that they also had an FE engine under the same cubic inch displacement. This one makes 190 horsepower, net horsepower at 2,000 RPM, 306 pound-feet, or 414 newton meters at 2,600 RPM, with a bore of 4 inches and a stroke of 3.3 inches. Up next, an absolute unicorn, 359 cubic inch displacement overhead valve, V8, 5.9 liters. It's good for an estimated 143 horsepower, 3,800 RPM, an estimated 322 pound-feet, or 436 newton meters at 2,000 RPM, with a bore of 4.05 inches and a stroke of 3.5 inches. Could be found in the F600 or larger trucks. On to the next one, 360 cubic inch displacement overhead valve, V8, 5.9 liters. It's good for 215 gross horsepower or 143 net horsepower at 4,000 RPM. 322 net pound-feet, or 436 newton meters at 2,000 RPM, with a bore of 4.05 inches and a stroke of 3.5 inches. Compression 7.2 to 1. Years this engine was used was between 1968 through 1976. It could be found in the Ford F100, F250, as well as other Ford trucks. Up next, another unicorn. 389 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8 6.4 liters. It's good for an estimated 199 net horsepower at 3,800 RPM. Estimated 342 pound-feet or 463 newton meters at 2,000 RPM with a bore of 4.05 inches and a stroke of 3.786 inches. Could be found in the F700, F750, and larger trucks. Moving on to the last engine in this engine family, 391 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8, 6.4 liters. It's good for 199 net horsepower at 3,800 RPM. 342 pound-feet or 463 newton meters at 2,000 RPM with a bore of 4.05 inches and a stroke of 3.79 inches. Years, circa 1964 through 1978. The FE and FT engines would be replaced by the Ford 335 engine family as well as the Ford 385 engine family, according to Wikipedia. And as they say, those engines are engines for another day. All right, now it's time for Would You Rather. 2 scenarios today. And if your favorite isn't listed, feel free, write it in. These are all Fords that could have these engines in them. Starting with the first scenario, 1965 Ford F-250 or 1970 Ford F-250 or 1975 Ford F-250. I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. On to the second scenario, 1966 Ford F-250 or 1969 Ford F-250 or 1972 Ford F-250. Once again, I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. Now it's time for Name That Tune. First person to get both the name of the band and the song title correctly in the comment section will have their comment pinned to the top of it. Hey, I just wanted to tell you, congratulations, you made it to almost the end of the video. Special thank you to Ben Parks III and Mark Chandler for supplying a lot of information for this episode, which is very scarce. Some of these engines, they just don't have information on the internet. So thanks again. Thank you everyone for making this car channel more than a car channel, a car community. I absolutely love reading the stories and the experiences that you had with these cars, and it means a lot to me. It means the world to me, actually. Until next time, toodaloo!